Hello, we're here once again today to have our discussion on the Indigenous Hands, the Indigenous Voices that is brought to you by Save the Deaf and Endangered Languages Initiative. Today, you see that I'm standing like a teacher. I want to continue on the discussion that we started last week about language acquisition and learning in Indigenous Deaf communities. And specifically, we mean Indigenous Deaf communities such that we can see in African continent. So today, to continue that discussion, I just want to show you what happens in the cognitive system of a typical deaf child, an average deaf child that grew up or that is growing up in Indigenous Deaf communities such that we have seen in a lot of our field works. Remember, I said I'm going to take this study in two directions. One is going to be focusing on the Indigenous Deaf communities language acquisition and learning, looking at the deaf child. So last week, I mentioned the linguistic blank slate of any child in the age of critical child development. And today we are going to be looking at what happens in the linguistic blank slate of an average deaf child in an Indigenous Deaf community. So this is our linguistic blank slate of a deaf child. It could be of any child so far. So every child that is born with this innate ability that we call the linguistic blank slate. Our linguistic blank slate is blank, and the child came to school with it. And what does the child want to do? The child wants to make sure that this blank slate is filled up. And how does that happen? By intuition, by natural endowment. The child is almost like mandated to make sure that this slate is filled up. Okay? Right. So our slate has two windows, or should be made up of two windows. These two windows are the windows through which language and linguistic elements should get into the slate and fill up this space. So we're going to be having our, sorry, I'm going to make it feel like I'm going to give our slate some properties of human. So this is window 1, this is our W1, and this is our W2. And what are these windows? Window 1 are the two ears. Window 2 are the two eyes. In other words, the two windows through which language, linguistic elements, and other behaviors will have to get into this slate to fill it up will have to be the auditory and the visual. Now, for a deaf child, of course you know that window 1 is totally blocked. It's closed. By condition, it is not going to be opened. Even if there is subsequently the use of cochlear implant, depending on the decibel of hearing, it is still not going to change a whole lot of things for the deaf child, depending on the degree of hearing loss and everything. So window 1 are the ear, window 2 the eyes. Now the other thing that we are going to look at is the conditions, the 3 C's that will make that will determine how much this slate is going to be filled up. The 3 C's. And what are the 3 C's? Number 1 of the 3 C's is language of immediate environment. Sorry, I'm being a teacher today. The second C is what? The presence of C2, caregivers, and other people in the life of the child. And the third thing, the third C is early access to language. early language access. So there's going to be presence of a language, there's going to be presence of the caregivers or persons in the life of the child that will help in modeling language, and there's going to be access to that language. Now, for the deaf child, the language of immediate environment should be sign language. Why? It is the window 2 that is functioning right now with the help of other neurocognitive appliances for this slate to be filled up, because window 1 is blocked, so window 2 is what is going on. So almost everything about language that will happen in this deaf child will come through visuals, the eyes. Let me not use too much jargon. The eyes. There has to be the immediate language, which is the sign language. There has to be the activities, the conscious effort of the caregivers and people that are in the life of the deaf child, and there has to be access to that language. Now, for the deaf child that we see, that we have studied in the indigenous deaf communities, look at where the problem we have. There is hardly language of immediate environment. C1 is almost not there. There is hardly access to any language. C3 is not there. There is presence of caregivers who you might say not there because their role in modeling language is almost zero. Because these caregivers are hearing caregivers, they are not deaf caregivers. We are talking about deaf child born in hearing family. So the caregivers do not sign because there is no sign language in the immediate environment, and the caregivers cannot help with the access, with the early access. And what is the early access? The age of critical child development, from the first day of a child to the child's first 5 years. Within this time, these conditions will have to take place. Now, for these slates to be filled up, what do we expect of the slate? We expect this slate to be filled up with cognitive knowledge, with cultural knowledge, with the behaviors that make this child to be able to meet up with social and emotional properties that make the child to become somebody that will be able to live in a society and show off all these emotions, all these feelings, and all these properties, and all these skills. The whole skill. Now, the slate is supposed to have strings of language. Now, remember, this is different from education. This is different from going to school. This is different from a person is illiterate. No, because literacy begins before formal education. And literacy goes with the language that we acquired within this particular time. Now, the question is, how much filled is the linguistic slate of a deaf child in that community that we are referring to, in those communities that we are referring to? How much filled is the linguistic blank slate of a deaf child? Is it half filled? Is it less than half filled? Is it quarter filled? This question is a little bit tricky to answer, but what we can say is that if these conditions, if these windows are closed and these conditions are not met, it is very much clear for one to say that a linguistic blank slate of a typical deaf child in the environment that we have been studying is probably not filled. And what does this mean to a deaf child? It means that IQ may or may not be affected. Of course, Not every neural skill is being affected by hearing loss. But remember also, we are not saying that deafness causes cognitive disabilities or cognitive poor development. No, we are not saying that. We are saying that lack of access to language. We are saying that absence of immediate language or language of immediate environment, and we are saying the passive action or the passive role of caregivers. All these put together, the three conditions not being present, are what will cause this slate not to be filled. And when this slate is not filled, one of the things it will cause is academic poor performance, what some people may call language gap. The child will not develop enough academic power, prowess, or skills to perform well in school, to perform well amongst friends and others. There may be some exceptions in some cognitive skills, like I mentioned, the IQ, the intelligent quotient, may or may not be affected. But the entire life of the child's adulthood, how the child is going to reason, how the child is going to see the world, and how the child is going to relate with others, this has a very strong implication. This has a very strong role to play. And how can we get this slate to be filled? Every typical child that is born where these conditions are in order or are totally functioning will have his or her linguistic blank slate filled up. It is natural. It is not a conscientious effort. It's something that happens. It is a completion of a biological and intellectual development that a child, mental development that a child is supposed to have. Deaf children have this similar problem, like children that have disability that impacts their speech and possibly comprehension of language and language expression. They may have some of these problems because this is having an issue, the linguistic blank slate. Now, what is our work here? Our work is to stand in the gap, to advocate for there to be a language of immediate environment that a child can have access to, and the active participation of the caregivers in modeling language. Now, it is modeling when we are talking about a normal condition whereby a child is born with the two windows working or functioning. But it becomes what we call early intervention program for any child that has any neurodevelopmental problem. A deaf child has issue with speech and language. Window 1 is closed, and for there to be these conditions met, there has to be what we call early intervention program. And this program is a conscious effort towards making language to be accessible, and that language has to be a language that resonates with the child's immediate environment. So if I use it in another word, a child's mother tongue, a child's first language, not the language that is being learned in school. Now, when this doesn't happen, the child goes into school, the kind of conditions that we've seen, or the kind of things that we've seen in schools, whereby the child goes into school, in addition to learning subjects, other subjects that make that child educated or something, the child is also learning a language. But unfortunately, in this case, the child is also learning a language that is regarded as foreign. He's learning a language that is written on books by people of different culture. The language is filled with words and expressions that are not in the child's immediate environment, because this child has not formed a lot of vocabulary, because there's no imitation. There's no imitation from caregiver to the child. No transmission of linguistic skills from the caregivers to the child. So the child is not necessarily acquiring anything through the caregivers and the people in his or her environment. So the vocabulary that the child will start building up with will be the vocabularies that come from the books that the child is being taught. Another condition, most of these children that we are studying are being taught by hearing people who are not first speakers or first signers, who are not native signers of that language. Now, this is very precarious. This is very, very, problematic for an average deaf child in an indigenous community. Now, to reverse this whole issue, number one, there has to be a language of immediate environment. The language that resembles, the language that portrays, the language that embodies the immediate environment of the child, the culture of the child, the language that the child can resonate with. And it comes down to the child as an inheritance. So that is why we are advocating for the development, the promotion of indigenous sign languages. And this extends to any other indigenous language, whether spoken or signed. And so today, I know that this might have been filled with some kind of linguistic jargon or so. We would be very happy if you can send your questions if you didn't understand some of the things or if you have any peculiar case. But in a nutshell, what I want you to understand today is that the linguistic blank slate of a deaf child may not be filled up if these conditions are not met, if these windows are not open, and if they are not functional. There are no two ways about it. The doctor cannot fix it. The educationist cannot fix it. That is why I think the earlier people that taught deaf people in France, they believed that deaf people are not teachable, that they would not learn. In fact, I can't remember the name of that scholar that referred to deaf children as idiotic and unteachable. As funny as that is. Anyway, but today in Indigenous Hands, Indigenous Voices, we are happy to share this knowledge, and we are also happy to receive your comments, your questions, and contributions to our study. Remember, do not forget to hit the button, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and also share the video to as many of your relatives as this video can benefit. I would like to see you next week. Once again, bye-bye.